21 transmissions, 21 different ways to shift a car, and every single one of them had the same fatal design flaw. Park and reverse sat right next to each other on the shifter pattern. No safety gate, no detent, no butt, just a quarter-inch of travel between stopped and going backward at full throttle. Thousands of people reached for park, found reverse instead, and drove straight through garage walls into storefronts over pedestrians. The mechanism was so obvious in hindsight that when you see the list of transmissions that did this, you will wonder how it took so long to fix. And here is the disturbing part. Nobody pulled the model. These transmissions stayed in production for years after the first deaths were documented. Some of them are still on the road today. Number 17 is in a car you definitely know, and the year it was finally recalled will make you check your own driveway. If you have ever wondered why modern regulations exist, you are about to get 21 very specific answers. Hit that subscribe button right now because this is the kind of automotive history nobody talks about and everybody needs to hear. The Chrysler TorqueFlite push-button transmission from the late 50s and early 60s. Those beautiful chrome buttons on the dashboard, park, reverse, neutral, drive, low. You pushed a button and the car shifted, felt like the future, looked incredible, gave the dashboard this spacecraft aesthetic that defined an entire era of American automotive design. In a panic stop, your hand shot forward to brace against the dashboard. If you hit reverse instead of park, the transmission would attempt to engage while the car was still moving forward. The resulting lurch could send the vehicle into traffic, into a wall, or over a pedestrian who thought the car was stopping. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration eventually required a minimum distance between reverse and park positions, along with a positive detent that required deliberate force to overcome. That ruled out the push-button design entirely. Modern transmissions have a physical gate and usually a button you must press before shifting into reverse. The TorqueFlite buttons had none of that, just a row of buttons with no safety interlock. Those buttons were gorgeous. They made every dashboard look like mission control, and in an emergency, they turned a simple mistake into a vehicle that suddenly lunged backward with no warning. The early Honda Accord column-shifted 3-speed automatic from the early 80s. This was Honda's first real attempt at a family sedan automatic in the American market. The shifter was a simple stalk on the steering column, park at the top, reverse right below it, then neutral and drive. No button, no gate, just a smooth pull down the column. In parking lots, drivers would reach up, pull the shifter, feel it click once, and assume they were in park. They were in reverse. The car would roll backward the moment they took their foot off the brake. Honda issued a service bulletin in 1983 recommending dealers install a detent spring to make the park position more distinct. It was not a recall, it was a suggestion. Thousands of these Accords stayed on the road with the original column shifter. The mechanism was simple. One click up from reverse was park, one click down from park was reverse. In dim light, in a hurry, with your attention on the kids in the back seat, that one click felt identical. Modern column shifters require a button press and have a pronounced gate that makes park physically distinct. The Accord did not. Clean design, absolutely no forgiveness. The Ford C4 and C6 column-mounted automatics used throughout the 70s and 80s in trucks and full-size sedans. These were everywhere, F-Series trucks, LTDs, Crown Victorias, millions of them. The shifter pattern was park, reverse, neutral, drive, second, low, all in a row on the column. The distance between park and reverse was less than half an inch. There was a button on the end of the stalk, but it only needed to be pressed when shifting out of park. Once you were in any other gear, you could move freely between all positions. That meant if you were rolling to a stop and reached up to put it in park, you could slide right past into reverse without pressing anything. The truck would lurch backward. In 1980, Ford added a more pronounced detent between park and reverse after multiple reports of rollovers caused by drivers accidentally selecting reverse while trying to park on inclines. It was not enough. The column shifter remained a source of unintended gear selection through the end of the 80s. Modern trucks use either a floor-mounted shifter with a deep gate or an electronic selector with confirmation feedback. The column shifter was convenient. It freed up the entire front bench seat, and it put park and reverse within a margin of error so small that tired drivers regularly confused the two. The Volkswagen Type 1 Beetle Auto Stick Semi-Automatic from 1968 to 1976. This was Volkswagen's answer to the demand for automatics without actually building a full automatic. It was a 3-speed manual with a torque converter and a vacuum-operated clutch. You shifted gears with a lever on the floor, but there was no clutch pedal. Park was a separate position at the top of the gate. Reverse was immediately adjacent. The shifter had no button and no safety lockout. You just pulled it from one position to the other. The problem was that park was not a true park. It was a mechanical lock in the transmission that would disengage if you applied enough force to the shifter. In many autostick Beetles, drivers would think they were in park, but the mechanism had not fully engaged. The car would roll. They would jump back in, grab the shifter to reset it, and accidentally pull it into reverse. The car would back over whatever was behind it. Volkswagen never recalled the autostick for this. They just quietly discontinued it in 1976 and never brought a semi-automatic to the US market again. The auto stick was clever engineering. It gave you the efficiency of a manual with the ease of an automatic. And it gave you a park position that felt engaged when it was not, and a reverse position right next to it with no gate in between. The Chevrolet Powerglide 2-speed automatic used in millions of GM vehicles from the 50s through the 70s. This transmission was legendary for its simplicity. 2 gears, low and high, almost nothing to brake. It was used in everything from Corvettes to Impalas. The shifter pattern was park, reverse, neutral, drive, low. On column shift versions, park and reverse were separated by less than a centimeter of travel. There was a button on the shifter, but like the Ford, it only locked you out of park. Once you pressed it and moved into any other gear, you could freely move between all positions. In 1972, GM added a spring-loaded detent to make park more distinct. The change was not retroactive. Millions of Powerglide-equipped vehicles stayed on the road with the original pattern. The physics were simple. You intended to move the shifter one position. You moved it two. The transmission did exactly what you told it to do. It went into reverse. Modern shifters have deep gates and require a butt press for every gear change. The Powerglide had a button you pressed once and then forgot about. Bulletproof transmission, absolutely unforgiving shifter. The Mercedes-Benz W123 column shifted automatic from the late 70s and early 80s. These were considered the pinnacle of automotive durability. Tanks, you could not kill them. The transmission was a 4-speed automatic with a column-mounted shifter. Park at the top, then reverse, neutral, drive, third, second. The shifter had a small button on the end that had to be pressed to move out of park. Once out of park, the button was not required for any other shifts. The detent between park and reverse was subtle. In freezing weather, when the mechanism was stiff, drivers would pull the shifter down, feel resistance, assume it was the park detent, and release. They were in reverse. The car would roll backward. Mercedes issued a technical service bulletin in 1982 describing the correct amount of force required to engage park. It was not a recall. It was a clarification. These W123 models are now considered classics. Many are still in daily use, and many still have the original column shifter with the original subtle detent. These cars will run forever. That does not mean the shifter will tell you where you are. The Dodge A9, 4 TorqueFlite column-shifted 3-speed used in Dodge Dart and Plymouth Valiant models through the 70s. This was a different TorqueFlite than the push-button version, but it carried the same name and the same design philosophy. Simple, durable, no unnecessary complexity. The column shifter had park, reverse, neutral, drive, second, low. The button on the shifter stalk was mechanical, not electronic. It physically blocked the shifter from moving out of park unless pressed. But once pressed and released, you could move freely through all other gears. The detent between park and reverse was a small metal ball bearing pressed into a groove by a spring. Over time, the spring would weaken. The detent would become less pronounced. Eventually, it would feel like a continuous motion from park to reverse with no stopping point in between. Chrysler did not recall these transmissions. They sold detent repair kits through dealerships for owners who complained. Most owners never complained. They just learned to be careful. That worked until they were in a hurry or tired or it was dark, and then it did not work at all. The A904 was one of the most reliable transmissions ever made. It would outlast the car it was installed in. The detent would not. The AMC Torque Command automatic used in Jeep CJ models and AMC passenger cars from the late 60s through the 80s. This was AMC's in-house automatic, and it was used in everything from Gremlins to Wagoneers. The column shifter had the standard park reverse neutral drive low pattern. The spacing between park and reverse was tight, and the detent was a simple spring and ball bearing setup identical to the Chrysler design. In Jeep CJ models, which were frequently used off-road, the shifter mechanism would get packed with mud and debris. The detent spring would clog. The shifter would move freely between all positions with no feedback. Drivers would stop on a trail, reach up to put it in park, and drop it into reverse. The Jeep would lurch backward off the trail or into another vehicle. AMC never addressed this in any formal way. The company folded in 1987, and Chrysler absorbed the Jeep brand. The Torque Command transmissions stayed in use through the early 90s in some Jeep models. No recall, no retrofit, just a transmission that worked perfectly until the shifter stopped telling you what gear you were in. The Nissan Datsun 280ZX automatic from the late 70s and early 80s. This car was a design icon, sleek, fast, gorgeous interior. The automatic transmission was a 3-speed with a floor-mounted shifter. Park was at the front of the gate, reverse immediately behind it. There was a button on top of the shifter that had to be pressed to move out of park. The problem was the button location. It was directly under your palm when you gripped the shifter. Many drivers would grip the shifter, press the button without realizing it, and pull back into reverse while intending to confirm park. The car would roll backward the moment they released the brake. Nissan redesigned the shifter button in 1982, moving it to the front of the shifter where it required deliberate thumb pressure. The change was not retroactive. Thousands of 280ZX automatics stayed on the road with the original button placement. This was not a weak detent problem. This was a button you could press by accident just by holding the shifter. Beautiful car, Absolutely unforgiving gear selector. The Jeep Wagoneer and Cherokee column-shifted automatic from the 80s and early 90s. These used a Chrysler-sourced transmission with a column shifter, park, reverse, neutral, drive, second, low. The detent between park and reverse was standard Chrysler, a spring-loaded ball bearing in a groove. The problem was specific to these trucks. The column shifter linkage ran down through the steering column under the dash and back to the transmission on the passenger side of the engine. It was a long run with multiple pivot points. Over time, the linkage would develop play. You would move the shifter to park and the transmission would be in reverse, or you would move it to reverse and the transmission would be in neutral. The shifter indicator on the column would say park, the transmission would say otherwise. Chrysler issued multiple technical service bulletins about adjusting the linkage. It was considered routine maintenance. It was not a recall. These trucks are now collectible. Many still have the original linkage with the original play. You put it in park. You check the indicator, it says park, the transmission is somewhere else. The Ford AOD 4-speed overdrive automatic introduced in the early 80s and used in Mustangs, Thunderbirds, and F-Series trucks. This was Ford's first widespread overdrive automatic, and it was a major improvement in fuel economy. The column shifter had the standard Ford pattern: park, reverse, neutral, drive, overdrive, second, low. The detent between park and reverse was improved from the earlier C4 and C6, but it was still a column shifter with a half-inch of travel between stopped and backward. The problem with the AOD was specific to Mustangs. The column shifter was mounted at an angle that made it difficult to reach from the low-slung driver's seat. Drivers would reach up, pull the shifter without looking, feel what they thought was the park detent, and release. They were in reverse. The Mustang would roll backward out of the parking space. Ford moved to a floor-mounted shifter for the Mustang in 1987. The AOD transmission continued in column-shift trucks through the early 90s. The transmission was excellent. The column shifter in a sports car was an ergonomic disaster. The Oldsmobile Jetaway Hydromatic used in Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and Buick models from the late 50s through the mid-60s. This was a 4-speed automatic which was advanced for the time. The column shifter had park, reverse, neutral, drive, third, second, low. The detent between park and reverse was a simple mechanical notch. No spring, no ball bearing, just a shaped piece of metal that the shifter slid over. When the mechanism was new, the notch was pronounced. After a few years of use, it would wear smooth. The shifter would glide from park to reverse with no resistance. Drivers would reach up, pull the shifter, feel it move, and assume it had stopped in park. It had not stopped, it was in reverse. The car would roll backward. GM never recalled the Jetaway for this. The transmission was replaced by the Turbo Hydromatic in the mid-60s, and the Jetaway faded out of production. Thousands remained in use through the 70s with worn detents and no way to replace them except a full shifter mechanism replacement that most owners never knew was available. The Toyota Cressida column-shifted automatic from the early 80s. This was Toyota's entry into the luxury sedan market in the US. The transmission was a 4-speed automatic with a column-mounted shifter. Park, reverse, neutral, drive, third, second. The shifter had a thumb button on the front that had to be pressed to move out of park. The detent between park and reverse was pronounced when the car was new. The problem was the thumb button itself. It was a small plastic button that would stick in the depressed position, especially in cold weather. If the button stuck, the shifter would move freely through all gears with no lockout. You could slide from park to reverse without realizing the button was stuck. Toyota issued a service campaign in 1983 to replace the thumb button mechanism with a metal version. It was not a mandatory recall. It was a voluntary service action. Many owners never brought their cars in. The Cressida developed a reputation as a reliable luxury car. The thumb button developed a reputation for sticking. Both reputations were accurate. The Buick Dynaflow 2-speed automatic used in Buick models from the late 40s through the early 60s. This transmission was known for its smooth shifts. It used a torque converter and a planetary gear set, and the shifts were nearly imperceptible. The column shifter had park, reverse, neutral, drive, low. The detent between park and reverse was a mechanical notch with no spring assist. The shifter was heavy. It required real force to move. That was considered a feature. It meant you would not accidentally shift. The problem was that the heavy shifter also meant you could not feel the detent. You would pull the shifter with enough force to move it 2 positions instead of 1. You intended park, you got reverse. The car rolled backward. Buick replaced the Dynaflow with the turbine drive transmission in the early 60s, which had a spring-loaded detent. The Dynaflow remained in use in older Buicks for years. That heavy, smooth shifter that felt so premium was also the reason you could not tell where you were in the gate until the car started moving in the wrong direction. The Chevrolet Turbo Hydromatic 400, which replaced the Powerglide and was used in nearly every GM vehicle from the mid-60s through the 90s. This transmission was in everything. Corvettes, Camaros, Suburbans, Cadillacs, millions of them. The column shifter had park, reverse, neutral, drive, third, second, low. GM improved the detent compared to the Powerglide, adding a spring-loaded mechanism that made park more distinct, but the improvement was relative. The distance between park and reverse was still less than an inch. The button on the shifter still only locked you out of park, not out of any other gear. In 1981, GM added a secondary detent that required additional force to shift from neutral into reverse. It was a small change, but it made unintended reverse selection much less common. The change was not retroactive. Millions of turbo-hydromatic transmissions built before 1981 stayed on the road with the original single detent design. This transmission would run for 300,000 miles. The detent would feel identical on mile 1 and mile 300,000. That was the problem, where was invisible until you missed park. The Mazda RX-7 automatic from the early 80s. This was a rotary-powered sports car with an optional 3-speed automatic. The transmission was sourced from Jatco, a Japanese supplier. The floor-mounted shifter had park at the front, reverse directly behind it, then neutral and drive. There was a thumb button on the side of the shifter. The button had to be pressed to move out of park or into reverse from neutral. The problem was the gate itself. It was a straight line. No bend, no offset, no physical separation between park and reverse except a detent. The detent was spring-loaded and felt positive when new. After a few years, the spring would weaken. The detent would become less distinct. You would move the shifter forward to park, feel a slight click and stop. You were in reverse. The RX-7 was a light car. When it rolled backward in reverse, it rolled fast. Mazda redesigned the automatic shifter gate in 1984, adding a bend that physically separated park from the other gears. The change applied only to new production. Earlier RX-7 automatics kept the straight-line gate. Brilliant engine, gorgeous car, shifter gate that gave you no help when the detent wore out. The Subaru Leon and early Loyal column-shifted automatic from the early 80s. This was Subaru's push into the American market with affordable all-wheel drive wagons. The column shifter had park, reverse, neutral, drive, second, low. The detent mechanism was a stamped steel spring that pressed a ball bearing into a groove. It was identical to the Chrysler and AMC design. The problem was specific to all-wheel drive models. If you parked on an incline and shifted into park, the weight of the vehicle would load the parking pawl and the transmission. When you returned to the car and tried to shift out of park, the shifter would resist. You would pull harder. The detent spring would flex. The shifter would suddenly break free and skip over reverse entirely, or it would land in reverse without you realizing it. Subaru added a shift lock mechanism in the late 80s that required the brake pedal to be pressed before the shifter would move out of park. That became standard across the industry. The early Leon and Loyal models did not have it. Just a column shifter, a worn detent, and a parking pawl that would fight you every time you parked on a hill. The Pontiac Fiero automatic from the mid-80s. This was GM's mid-engine sports car. The automatic transmission was a turbo-hydromatic derivative with a floor-mounted shifter. Park was at the front of the gate, reverse immediately behind it. The shifter had a thumb button that locked you out of park and reverse. You had to press the button to select either gear. That should have solved the problem. It did not. The button mechanism in the Fiero was cable-operated, not mechanical. The cable ran from the shifter, through the center console, under the driver's seat, and back to the transmission. The cable would stretch over time. When it stretched, the button would not fully disengage the lock. You would press the button, feel it move, and pull the shifter. The lock would catch. You would pull harder. The shifter would break free and overshoot into the wrong gear. GM issued a technical service bulletin in 1986 describing how to adjust the cable tension. It was not a recall. The Fiero was discontinued in 1988. Thousands of them stayed on the road with stretched cables and shifters that required a specific amount of force to move, and no way to know if that force would land you in park or in reverse. The Volvo 240 column-shifted automatic used throughout the 70s and 80s. Volvo built a reputation on safety. These cars had reinforced passenger compartments, advanced crumple zones, and some of the best braking systems available. The column shifter had park, reverse, neutral, drive, third, second. The detent between park and reverse was a spring-loaded ball-bearing mechanism. It was well-engineered. It felt positive. It also wore out. After 100,000 miles, which most Volvo 240s exceeded easily, the detent spring would weaken. The shifter would move between park and reverse with minimal resistance. Volvo did not recall these shifters. They sold replacement detent mechanisms through dealerships as maintenance items. Most owners never replaced them. The car ran forever, and the shifter worked well enough that you only noticed the weak detent when you made a mistake, and then you noticed immediately. Safest car on the road in a collision. No help at all when you put it in reverse instead of park. The Cadillac Eldorado and Seville front-wheel drive models from the late 70s and early 80s. These used a turbo-hydromatic transmission with a column shifter. The shifter pattern was standard GM. Park, reverse, neutral, drive, third, second, low. The detent was the improved spring-loaded version GM introduced in the mid-70s. The problem was not the detent. It was the column itself. The Eldorado and Seville had tilt steering columns that could be adjusted for height and angle. The shifter linkage ran through the tilt mechanism. If the column was tilted all the way down, the linkage would bind. The shifter would move, but the transmission would not. You would put the shifter in park, the indicator would say park, and the transmission would still be in reverse. The car would roll backward. Cadillac issued a service bulletin in 1981 instructing dealers to lubricate the column linkage and advise owners not to tilt the column to the lowest setting. It was not a recall. It was advice. These Cadillacs were luxury vehicles. The tilt column was a feature. Using that feature could disconnect your shifter from your transmission, and you would not know until the car moved. Every single one of these transmissions stayed in production after the first documented incidents. Every one of them remained on the road for years after the design flaw was obvious. The regulations that eventually required shift interlocks, brake shift interlocks, and positive detents with secondary locking mechanisms were written in response to decades of unintended gear selection. The specific number of fatalities is hard to pin down because these incidents were often recorded as driver error, not mechanical failure. The driver put the car in reverse. The fact that they intended park was not captured in the crash report. Modern transmissions require you to press the brake pedal before shifting out of park. They have electronic shifters that confirm gear selection on the dashboard. They have physical gates that make it nearly impossible to move from park to reverse without deliberate effort. Some new vehicles do not even have a mechanical connection between the shifter and the transmission. It is all electronic, with multiple redundancies and confirmation systems. That is all because of these 21 transmissions and the thousands like them that put park and reverse within a quarter inch of each other and expected drivers to never make a mistake. Next time you get in your car and shift into park, notice how much effort it takes. Notice the button you have to press. Notice the brake pedal interlock that will not let you shift unless your foot is on the brake. That is all there because for decades it was not. Drop a comment telling me which of these transmissions you have owned or which one shocked you most. Next time I am going deep on safety features that were standard in the 90s and have quietly disappeared from modern cars. Features you think are still there, features you assume are required, some of them are gone and nobody told you.